Okay, there are two ways of looking at the causes of war. One, the easy and obvious one, is that war is the result of decisions that individuals make. There's another way to look at that, and that is that war is the inevitable result of grand historical forces, and that the decisions individuals make and the words that individuals use don't make that much difference. It's hard to see grand historical forces when you're in the middle of them, but I would suggest that we're living through an experiment on this question. George W. Bush wanted war with Iraq, and his administration carefully orchestrated all the steps to prepare American opinion for war, and ultimately he got the war he wanted. I believe that Barack Obama does not want war with Iran, and yet all the same things are happening. Do you remember weapons of mass destruction? We heard about them so often that we came to call them WMDs. We learned that Saddam Hussein was the embodiment of evil. The press and the media happily jumped on board and trumpeted every report of weapons programs, including the famous aluminum tubes and the purchase of uranium from Niger. We tried sanctions. Sanctions went on for 10 years without bringing the regime to heel. We talked about negotiations, but no serious negotiations really took place. So finally, we had no choice. We had to have a war with Iraq. So fast forward to Iran. Every day we're hearing about Iran's nuclear weapons program. We've heard it so often that everybody knows Iran has a nuclear weapons program. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is the embodiment of evil. And if that isn't enough, or in case he should disappear from the scene, there's the shadowy Grand Ayatollah lurking behind him. The news media has happily jumped on board. And this is really interesting because after no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq, we heard all sorts of apologies from them. We were tricked. It'll never happen again. We won't let it happen. Well, it's happening again. I'm not accusing the media of some nefarious plot. They're just doing what comes naturally. The Huffington Post online newspaper has an interesting practice. They will put up an article with 2 or 3 different headlines, and then they count the clicks. And then they'll move it to the front page using whichever headline got the most clicks. Now, is that a recipe for sensationalism? So now we've tried sanctions with Iran. So far, sanctions haven't worked. The Iraq sanctions went on for over a decade. That can't happen with Iran because the focus of the sanctions has been to take Iran's oil off the world market. The world market can't survive very long without Iran's oil. So one way or another, those sanctions have to come to an end. We've tried negotiating with Iran. Negotiations have taken place, but without success, with one exception. Turkey and Brazil. Obama invited Turkey and Brazil to negotiate on our behalf. Their presidents personally participated in it, brought back a signed agreement, and our State Department dismissed it out of hand. So that's as close as we've gotten to successful negotiations with Iran. So we've come to a state where tensions are high. Sanctions serve to increase tensions. If you think that sanctions are an alternative to war, look around and see who's pushing sanctions the hardest. It's the same people that are pushing war the hardest. Sanctions are just a step on the road to war. When tensions are high, and now in the Persian Gulf we have military forces eyeball to eyeball. We have, as Dick mentioned, aircraft carrier groups in the Persian Gulf. Iran has shore-based missiles with a speed of 2,000 miles per hour, which are said to be capable of sinking an aircraft carrier. So lives are at stake. In that situation, people get nervous. They get trigger happy. Any little scare can set things off and quickly grow up into open war. And in case that accident doesn't happen, grow up in open war, there are agencies who are ready, willing, and capable of manufacturing that accident. The CIA and the Mossad are both know how to do that kind of thing. If it appeared that Iranian forces had attacked an American ship, what president could not respond with military force? Remember the Maine? Remember Pearl Harbor? Remember the Tonkin Gulf incident? We aren't really sure of the authenticity of any of those incidents, but everyone led to war. What is an act of war? The cyber attack that destroyed or damaged a lot of Iran's centrifuges, was that an act of war? Are sanctions an act of war? Is assassination of enemy officials an act of war? Dick's already talked about the MEK, the terrorist group. The MEK is on the State Department's list of terrorist groups. But under the doctrine that the enemy of our enemy is our friend, the MEK has had training by the CIA in the Nevada desert. I believe Seymour Hersh. Thank you. Bibi Netanyahu is said to watch opinion polls closely. And let's be clear, when a politician watches opinion polls, he's not seeking the wisdom of the masses. He knows what he wants to do, and his question is, can I get away with it? There have been a number of opinion polls of the Israeli public's attitude towards Iran, and Dick referred to one that found 64% would be willing to, appreciate a Middle East nuclear-free zone, even if it included giving up their own nuclear weapons. The question has been asked in a lot of different ways. The results are all over the place. Obviously, the result depends on how the question is worded and the care with which the poll is taken. But an analyst who tried to integrate all these different polls and draw some sense out of them concluded that Israeli public opinion is divided into three roughly equal parts. 1/3 of Israelis would unambiguously support a strike against Iran. Another third of the Israeli populace would unambiguously oppose a strike against Iran. And that middle third says, well, it depends. And more than anything else, it depends on whether it can be done with American support. That's the most important swaying factor to them. The Israeli government has done their best to sway Israeli public opinion in favor of war. They've been trumpeting the success of their new missile shield, which they had a chance to try out against the rockets that randomly come in from Gaza, and they've been fairly effective there. They've released a military study which concluded that there would be at most 300 civilian deaths in the Iranian response to their attack on Iran. But the Israelis are hearing noises from the other side as well. There are not nearly enough gas masks or bomb shelters for the population of Israel. The most surprising thing was an anti-war statement from a leading settler rabbi. Now, settler rabbi means far-right Zionist nationalist, but this guy came out against war with Iran. And presumably the thinking that underlies that is that in a real war, those missile defenses would be deployed around the Israeli cities. And the settlements, which are outside Israel's borders, they're a priority now, but they would sink to the bottom of the priority scale in a real war. Israel has a range of options if they decide to attack Iran. At one end of the scale, they might try to blanket the whole country, take out every nuclear installation and every defense organization. At the other end of the scale, there's the possibility that it would be a very selective strike, and they would try to hit just a few key nuclear installations. They would hope that in that case the Iranian response would be limited, or even possibly that Iran might try to pretend it didn't happen, and that's what Syria did when Israel bombed the Syrian reactor. Now this estimate of 300 civilian deaths sounds pretty optimistic. Is that based on that scenario of a limited exchange? The Pentagon held some war games simulating an Israeli attack on Iran. They came to a very different conclusion. They found that that limited attack very quickly blew up into a regional war. Netanyahu takes a optimistic view of every aspect of war. Was that study of 300 civilian deaths based on optimistic interpretation of the limited scenario? President Obama badly wants to be reelected, and I've chosen the word badly with great care. That's a tricky issue when it comes to Iran policy. On the one side, he has AIPAC, the American-Israeli lobby, which wants war, part of the answer to your question, and is firmly behind Netanyahu. And if he's going to, and AIPAC is very influential in American politics. Influential in American politics means got a lot of money direct to candidates. To keep them happy, he has to toe the line with Netanyahu. But on the other hand, he knows that if there's war in the Persian Gulf, the price of oil will spike and the economic recovery will come to a quick end. That's not a path to re-election. So he's trying to thread his way between these two problems, and his solution is to attempt at least to delay war until after the election. And he's sent Secretary Panetta and Chairman Dempsey to Israel with the message, we're not backing you, don't start a war at this time. Those two guys have not spoken out as publicly as their predecessors, but apparently their position is the same. They understand that war in the Middle East, another war in the Middle East would be a disaster for us. We just can't afford it. Obama canceled some joint missile exercises with Israel on the pretext of unpreparedness. Now that should be a message to the Israeli public. If they think that missile shield is going to protect them, is it really ready? One Jewish analyst has claimed that there have been a series of information leaks from unnamed U.S. officials aimed at swaying Israeli public opinion against war. One of the subtler distinctions that Obama has made that is actually very important is on the definition of the red line. The red line is the line that must not be crossed or will have to act. Netanyahu's definition of the red line is that Iran must not reach a nuclear capability such that we couldn't stop them from making a bomb. Obama's red line is Iran must not make a bomb. Now, the difference doesn't sound like a big deal, but the latter definition allows a lot more time for negotiation. Now, negotiation is starting today. The P5+1 meetings are being held today in Istanbul. P5 means the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and the +1 is Germany, negotiating with Iran over their nuclear program. I won't try to predict the outcome of those negotiations and be proven wrong tomorrow. The track record for negotiation isn't good. We had the one-year success where Turkey and Brazil negotiated on our behalf. The State Department said it was too little too late. Other people say, well, it was electoral politics. And some say it was the neocons who have too much influence inside the State Department. And that's the other part of the answer to the question about who's working for war. One group is AIPAC, the other group is the neocons. One hopes that Obama has taken a firmer hand over the State Department and given them clear instructions on what he wants to happen in these negotiations. We'll see. It's also not encouraging that the State Department is going into these negotiations with some pretty heavy demands. They're demanding that, among them, for example, they're demanding the closure of that Fordo plant that Dick talked about. It's buried so deeply under a mountain that even the biggest bunker busters would be unlikely to damage it. Now that's a nuclear enrichment facility. It is being inspected by the IAEA. So they're not saying, we want your stuff up in the open where we can inspect it. They're saying, we want your stuff up in the open where we can bomb it. Not likely to be well received. The newspaper columnists are full of good advice to the negotiators. Some of it's obviously political. Some of it really is good advice based on things like the book Getting to Yes. Among that advice, the most believable is the road to a successful agreement is going to be long and hard, and the most important thing is patience. Now there are some real obstacles to international negotiation. It's vulnerable. One thing it's vulnerable to is electoral politics. Neither side can afford to make concessions that won't be accepted by the public at home. The other thing it's vulnerable to is terrorism. Somebody sets off a bomb someplace and everybody gets mad and walks out. It's just too easy. Among the good advice for negotiators is there needs to be a clear statement of the interests of both sides. And some of these columns about the negotiation contain real good lists of the interests of both sides, and they're worth examining and thinking about how much concession can you imagine happening on these points. I'm concerned that there's an underlying interest that is not negotiable, and I didn't see it mentioned in any of these lists. That is, the United States wants to dominate the Middle East, and Iran doesn't want to be dominated.